our story about being queer and being in love for so long a period of time and having HIV is, in a sense, a universal story. You know, the story is not a gay love story. It's a universal story of love that happens to be between two men. The fight we had because of HIV infection is sadly a fight that a lot of people will have with whatever afflictions hit them.
So hello, however you are listening to us, welcome to Being LGBTQ, where all voices matter, with me, Sam Weiss, and today we're going to be talking about HIV and AIDS, which I think is something which will always stick with the LGBTQ community, perhaps more than any other, and obviously so many lives cut short far too soon, so many young lives, and it's a chapter of history which I think must never be forgotten and must be passed down through the generations, not just in terms of information about the virus itself, but also the stigma which still goes along with it to this very day. And back at the height of the epidemic, the way the lives, particularly of gay and bisexual men, weren't valued at all, basically, which why it took so long for governments really to start taking notice, and the stigma was just horrendous back in the 80s and the 90s. Of course, the stigma is still very much with us to this day, but thankfully, just because of course, scientific advancements and medical research, it's not as bad as it used to be. And I've been speaking to the author of Living and Loving in the Age of AIDS, which is Derek Frost, and through the book he wanted young people to know what happened. And Derek's also the founder of AIDS Arc, founder and trustee, which he founded in 2002, and Derek's husband Jeremy Norman created the Embassy Club and Heaven, which are two LGBTQ venues, very well known LGBTQ venues here in the UK. And Jeremy's battle lasted for 6 years, and you can imagine back at the time in the 90s was just, as you'll hear in this interview, was very much a death sentence at that time in this country. But of course, in this interview, we also talk about the fact that it is still a death sentence in other parts of the world, unfortunately. Now, the book's been described by Professor Linda Gale Bakker, the past president of the International AIDS Society, as incredibly vivid, moving and compelling, and former MP Matthew Parris described it as both a history and an inspiration. I heard that you once said that you felt lockdown was a valuable time of reflection, and I sort of really agree with you there. I think that's maybe been one of the positives, shall we say, of the lockdown situation. You know, I consider myself incredibly fortunate and privileged, because I know lockdown has been hideous for huge swathes of the population around the world. In that I do feel fortunate that there have been benefits, in that a lot of my kind of external life is quietened down to some degree, and it's allowed my internal life and the things that might go on at home to get louder, and for me to give more attention to those things, and I've appreciated that and enjoyed it. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and again, I've been in a very privileged position of being able to just carry on working at home and stuff like that, which of course others haven't had the luxury of being able to do. But just to come, of course, to your memoir and Living and Loving in the Age of AIDS, could you first of all tell us a bit about it, and when you really decided to get all of your experiences down on paper? Yeah, well, I think I started working on it about 4 years ago, so quite a long time back. And it was 4 years ago was about 2 years after we resigned as trustees of this charity we started
in 2002 called AIDS ARC, which was a charity that set out to buy antiretroviral drugs for people in other countries who weren't able to access those drugs. And when we resigned as trustees of the charity, I realized that, you know, we'd achieved some really interesting things, and I thought it was important to set the record down of what we'd achieved. I showed that to a publisher, or in fact to my brother-in-law, who's had a long career in the publishing world. And he said it's something that wouldn't really be of interest, this record, to a wider public, and else I attached to it my own story, or our own story, and what had brought us to start that charity. And that, you know, I realized was a huge sort of intrusion into our privacy, and particularly a painful period in our time when Jeremy was battling to stay alive through having HIV, being HIV positive at a time when medication wasn't available. But the thing that swayed me to do it really was I realized that, you know, we had a very, not unique perspective, but a very particular perspective into the whole AIDS journey. One, because we own nightclubs in the late 70s, early 80s, which made us leaders in the sense of the whole celebration associated with gay liberation. Then we started one AIDS charity in the sort of late 80s, which was called Crusade, which was largely directed to helping people with HIV. We didn't start, we co-started at that period. And that was largely directed at helping people in the UK.
Yeah. And
then Jeremy got positive and he had his battle to survive. So I thought it was an important record. And I particularly thought that young people would at some stage really value having this kind of a record available to them. And it was that really directed me to do this, to make, you know, our record, to set our record down for the benefit of young people who might be interested in these big experiences which have shaped our community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like essential, really, that younger generations know what happened. I would actually call it essential to really know and to know our history as well. And
yeah, I mean, what's really interesting, you know, in the advent of It's a Sin, there's 30-something million people around the world, and even last year, 2019, I think was recorded, you know, killed up, you know, as many as 700,000 people. You know, it's still very much alive, although it's a battle that's being won, I'm happy to say, in really exciting and encouraging ways. And it's also brilliant in a way that young people don't have to worry about it. You know, if you know, you're sexually active, if you're lucky to be able to get hold of PrEP, you just carry on. You know, that's a wonderful achievement.
Exactly. And obviously mentioning It's a Sin there, I mean, it was just incredible to see the amount of attention that got and how well received it was by the LGBTQ community, but also beyond that as well. And I'm just wondering, what did you think of the series as a viewer?
Well, I was thrilled it happened. I really, really enjoyed watching it. It served an amazingly important purpose in awakening people's attention to this important part of history in our community. It was beautifully acted. It was really clever. You know, you present a whole load of characters that you all fall in love with, and then you kill them off. You know, it was like perfect TV. And sadly, you know, it was very accurate and very true for those early days. You know, it was interesting. It was largely focused, as you know, from sort of 81 to 91. Most of our friends, and we knew a hell of a lot of people in London because of our background in the nightclub world, you know. Most of our friends, I think the first person in the UK who we knew who died, who interestingly was the son of Anthony Eden, who'd been the British Prime Minister. He died in 86, I think I'm right in saying. And so that was the first person. So in terms of the sort of time perspective of Russell's piece, It's a Sin, and our experience. But we spent a lot of time in America in the 80s. And so, you know, the arrival of AIDS in, you know, that first New York piece that was printed in 81, you know, we were very much aware of. We knew about the arrival. And in fact, in It's a Sin, although it was referred to very, very quietly, that very, very important, pivotal New York piece that was written in July 81, referring to 41 either gay men, or I don't know how we were described, who died of AIDS, or then, of course, not call AIDS, call the gay plague. Now, I think It's a Sin has been wonderful, and the fact it's awoken attention around the world is very gratifying and absolutely excellent. And I'm grateful to all the people who were involved for the hard work that it took to get that to happen, and it was excellent.
Just on that point as well, I think it's quite interesting how it's got two different functions, so to speak. So it's about informing people in this country about exactly what happened, whether that be the LGBTQ community or beyond that, but also, like you say, this really important element of what's going on in other parts of the world, because I've seen people, of course, rightly say in countries where you can get the treatment that it's no longer a death sentence. But do you think we really need to raise more awareness of the fact that in other parts of the world it still is?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, our work, the second charity the second charity we started in 2002 was entirely directed at looking at AIDS in other countries where antiretrovirals weren't available. We took a decision that the provisions of the NHS, say, in this country were basically sorting the problem for most people here. So our attention very much went to other countries, and it's still very much in other countries. And it is clearly essential, because, you hear people now saying, well, it's not a problem any longer. And you say, yeah, but it was a problem for the 700,000 people who died in 2019. It's very much a war that's still being fought. So I think, it's essential that's reiterated. And, it's very gratifying that young people do pay attention and are conscious of that, certainly through our charity AIDS.org. A lot of the support we get is from young queer people, which is fantastic, given, that in this country, the problem is largely resolved for people who are able to access the drugs or who choose to access the drugs.
I think that's a really good point as well. And it's certainly, in terms of the more attention being drawn to It's a Sin, I was very aware of what happened in terms of HIV and AIDS, but it certainly got me thinking much more about the bigger picture. And like you said, those deaths, 700,000. I mean, I looked that figure up myself, and I was just staggered by it. I knew people were dying, but I didn't realize it was still on such a level.
Yeah, and there's a lot. In some cases it's because the drugs aren't available. In other cases it's because, you'll know some of these things, because the levels of stigma are still so high. That people are still frightened to come out and be honest about their HIV status, etc., etc. We've learned a lot of truths about different cultures and different points of view in other countries, and but huge advances have been made. Huge advances have been made, and there's talk about a sort of an AIDS-free generation. I think the target is for 2030 or something. It's not too far away. Given how things were. These hopefully will be achievable targets across the world.
I think it's that 2030 target is to have zero transmissions in this country. I think, I'm not sure if it's the UK or just England.
Yeah. Well, that should be achievable, as long as, I'm not quite sure. Is the NHS paying for PrEP on demand?
I think there's been a lot of discussions around PrEP. I think in Wales, it is NHS funded now, and I think it's a bit slower in the other nations, I think.
Maybe we should explain to your viewers that, who don't know, PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis, i.e. taking the drugs on a regular basis so that when and if you're exposed to the virus, it can't cause you harm, and more importantly, prevents you from obviously infecting other people. Safe sex is a bit out the window now, and I refer to this wonderful thing I heard from friends of mine who live in Los Angeles, this kind of thing that young people are going around saying, fucking without fear is the new kind of fabulous thing to say, because, safe sex is over, like you can chuck your condom out the window and take PrEP, and it's back to the sort of 60s, or back to, the days of liberation, which is terrific, terrific.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that, but thank you for sharing.
Great, and of course it's important, it's really, really sad, and it applies to STDs of all sorts, doesn't it? But, if something as beautiful as fucking is colored by fear, and of course, I suppose in the heterosexual community, there's always been the fear of pregnancy as well as STDs. We haven't had to deal with that, thank God. But, sex should be a beautiful and joyful and loving and wonderful thing that isn't associated with fear. And, AIDS made people very fearful, of course.
Yeah, I think it's obviously important we've just mentioned PrEP there, because I think, there's a lot of ignorance that still exists today in this country when it comes to HIV. I mean, I saw the Terence Higgins Trust recently called out Dr. Hilary Jones on Good Morning Britain, basically for misinformation and not even knowing things like undetectable equals untransmittable, and even this comparison between HIV and coronavirus, which is a completely inaccurate comparison. So,
what kind of comparisons did she make? Because I missed that. I mean, there are parallels, but there are so many differences.
Yeah, I think it was just there wasn't anything specific as such. It was just the way they put them together as if they were like the same kind of condition, when obviously the transmission of the two conditions is completely different. So it just seems like, that was a pandemic, so therefore every pandemic is the same. So I just think I think the main criticism was it drew unhelpful comparisons, I think was the wording.
Right, yeah. Well, that's certainly very interesting. I mean, the differences are enormous, I mean, one of the most marked differences, is that the world has embraced trying to deal with the COVID problem as fast and effectively and chucking as much money at it as is possible. And everyone is very happy about that. Most people have forgotten or didn't know how hard the queer community had to work to force governments to pay. I mean, this is mostly directed to America, of course, how hard we all had to work to encourage, or more than encourage, sort of smack on the head the US government and the medical fraternity there to actually pay any attention to AIDS at all. I mean, Reagan was the president from 81 to 89, and he famously didn't even mention the word AIDS until something like 86, by which time, thousands of queer people had died. And then ACT UP formed, this wonderful organization which literally took its kind of battle into the streets, and forced the government funding to be made available, and the medical people to get going. And I mean, there's a very interesting, every time I see Professor Fauci on the thing talking about COVID, it's really, really interesting, because within he was in exactly the same position in his organization as he was during the AIDS period. And at that time, you probably know this, but, Larry Kramer, the great sort of activist of ACT UP, at the time called Fauci a murderer for, resisting the development of drugs in order to save lives. I mean, publicly called him a murderer. And Fauci, to his credit, a number of years post that, actually, admitted the fact, that Kramer had done such an amazing job and how important he had been in speeding the arrival of medication. So, the queer community did a fantastic, fantastic job of speeding the arrival of medication, which has benefited, millions of people across the world. We should be very proud of that. And it should be known, that we made such important contributions.
Just fighting for the right to survive in a lot of respects, really. I think it's awful that back then, obviously, that gay lives were just seen as disposable in a way, not worth the time of trying to sort out what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely bad. We had to fight to be noticed, and a body of people, perhaps in the early days of it, particularly within the Reagan administration, definitely had a view that we were kind of disposable and happily disposed of. I mean, it was outrageous, but that was a while back, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, just to go back to, of course, the early 80s, and I'm just wondering, was there a point that you really noticed that something was terribly wrong if that makes sense to you. When was it that you first started to become aware of HIV and AIDS, or like you said, as it was called back then, the quote unquote gay plague?
Well, we were lucky enough from the early 80s, I think even sort of 80 or so, to become very regular visitors to a sort of gay paradise called, the Key West in Florida,
Yeah.
which at that time was sort of gay party central. And we used to go down there quite a bit. And so we got to know a lot of young Americans partying at that time. And it was there really that we first heard about this thing. And it started with a very, very, very quiet voice. You can imagine, that New York thing that came out in 81, about 41 people that had died. It was hardly a whisper. No one ever heard, no one hardly heard the whisper. But we were in a place where the whispering was going on. And so we probably heard it as early on as most people did. And it wasn't something that was, it wasn't like the sort of day you suddenly realize that you're not going to live forever. Like when you're a kid, you realize one day, oh my God, I'm going to die one day. It kind of wasn't like that. It was more slowly, this kind of thing crept up and got louder and louder until one started to take it increasingly seriously. I think that's how it was. And for us, it was when we were in Florida. It was ironic because Florida was or Key West was like the ultimate gay party place. It was like sort of being in paradise and then this terrible monster arriving in paradise.
Yeah, I mean, Key West is on my bucket list for places to visit. just to mention that.
I mean, please go. I hope you have a great time. I wish you'd gone there 20 years ago, or 40 years ago. I mean, it was an extraordinary place, and the gays really discovered it, and I say they discovered it. It was obviously there, but it was in very poor shape. And, a group of kind of fancy New York queens basically sort of found the place and started to make it their own, and then it attracted others. And it was a hell of a lot of fun, Unfortunately, the cruise ships discovered it subsequently, and now it's become sort of mass.
A port.
Yeah, kind of. But, nice nonetheless, But if you get to go there, Sam, let me know and I'll give you a few tips, like what to avoid, and don't have a car and get a bicycle and, get onto the ocean. I mean, it's a very beautiful place.
Excellent. Brilliant. And I know you've been to Studio 54 as well, which I'm like majorly envious about.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I went one night. I mean, it was on my first visit to New York, and I was with a bunch of people, and they just said, let's go. I mean, that was in 74 or 5, I guess, something like that. I mean, it was before I met Jeremy. I met Jeremy in 77. Yeah. So it was before then. And it was terrific, I mean, Studio 54 was a complete phenomenon, and it was great. But, there were a lot of other amazing clubs. I mean, I refer to in my book another, great New York club, which was the Saint, which was extraordinary in this kind of vast space that had been a cinema or a theatre. I'm not sure exactly what. And they'd put this huge planetarium into it. And, it was orgiastic and drug-filled and fabulous, and I like to think that, the clubs that we started, I mean, Jeremy paid attention to those clubs before I knew him, and it was because of the attention he paid to clubs like Studio 54, etc., but more, 12 West and, the gay ones, the gay New York clubs, that caused him to revamp the Embassy Club and turn that into the extraordinary place that it was, and then subsequent to that, to do what he really had wanted to do, which was to start a sort of huge gay dance club in London, which he did, and which amazingly still continues it continues open.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, obviously, like, in terms of the clubs you're referring to, the Embassy Club and Heaven, I mean, Heaven's just iconic, really. That wouldn't really, if you mention it, people know what it is, if that makes sense. Well, in context, we're not talking about Heaven as in up there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect name, isn't it? We were just saying the other day, it really is the perfect name, and it sort of was, And for us, I mean, I remember the time when we sat down, with lists of names and saying, what should we call the place? What should we call the place? So heaven it became, and heaven it was for thousands and thousands and thousands of people. It was something great. And there's a because of its anniversary, there's a film at the moment being made about it, and we were sent a clip from the sort of promo, and there's a journalist called Cheryl Garrett who interviewed in it, and she said, I'm sort of quoting, I hope accurately, if it wasn't for places like heaven, there might not or there would not be gay marriage now. Wow, that is pretty fabulous. If we've contributed to that, then that's something to feel very proud of, and we do.
I think it's just these, obviously, spaces for gay LGBTQ people are so important, even, of course, now they remain such a vital part of the community, because I sense it's that, I guess it's that sense of belonging. I mean, I remember the first time that I went to a gay club, and, the rainbow flag was outside, and it just felt so liberating, and you just felt like this is a space where I can be myself. And, I'm pretty sure that even to this day, for a lot of young LGBTQ people, they'll have that same reaction.
No, definitely. I mean, I don't know if it's easier for people to come out now, but I don't think it is in a way, because, the law protects us, we're celebrated, everyone knows other gay people, queer people, all of that. But when you're very young, I think, we all want to be what everyone else is. And the initial realization that you're different from everyone else in a certain way, or different from the mass of people, is not something probably that most people initially welcome. When you're young, say you're 12 or 13 or something, and you start to realize, wow, I'm different, I'm fancying boys and not girls. As you say, to see that rainbow flag up there and say, no matter what, here's a place of welcome. It's really, really important for young people now, as much as it was then, and I think the whole support that we get from the gay family is, I use the word gay, queer, but LGBTQ family is hugely sustaining and hugely important. Someone said to me the other day, they said, a queer person of my age or slightly younger, and they said, well, what's the point in the queer family anymore? You can just hang out like everyone else. We're no different from anyone else. And when you want to get laid, you go on Grindr or whatever. And it's like, and I said, no, you're absolutely missing the point. That being queer is not, obviously not just about sex. It's about who you are.
Yeah.
And to some extent, we all want to be with other people who are like us. And that's fine and should be celebrated.
Yeah. And,
we're not just regular people who have sex with men. No, we're LGBTQ people. We're queer people, and we're proud of it, and it's brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not. I've never understood the argument of it's segregation and things like that. I just think that's, like you said, completely missing the point, essentially. I do want to talk about, of course, your husband Jeremy, and you said he was diagnosed with HIV in 1991. So, can you think back to when Jeremy got that diagnosis and what was going through your head at the time? Like we said earlier, it was a death sentence back then.
Yeah, no, it wasn't good, that's for sure.
No.
I write about it in the book, and I've tried to be very honest. And, my honesty has been assisted by the fact that from the day Jeremy tested positive, I kept a diary, which I kind of used as my sort of a place to go and scream privately. It wasn't really written to be seen by anyone else, but it's a record which is still there and which I went into when I was writing my book. So I have got a very, vivid memory of that time and have tried to write about it. To be handed out a death sentence is not great. But it's not unique to people who have AIDS, clearly. I think, what transpired during the writing of the book is that our story about being queer and being in love for so long a period of time and having HIV is in a sense a universal story, because we don't have a gay, the story is not a gay love story. It's a universal story of love that happens to be between two men. And the story of the fight we had because of HIV infection is sadly a fight that a lot of people will have with whatever afflictions hit them. So I hope the message and the writing will actually help many people outside the queer community as well as within it, who face the challenges that we all face through life, So it's a slight diversion from your question. How did I feel when you got a death sentence? We felt very confused and very upset. Yeah. And we hid away for a number of days in complete darkness in our bedroom and hardly dared even talk to each other because the prospect of what we were facing was so appalling. And we're big lovers of nature, and so really nature drew us out of the darkness, and spring was coming, and we spent a lot of time in nature that year, and that helped to restore our courage and our determination to beat the fight that lay ahead.
Yeah, I put on my notes for this interview, and I actually put in bold, can you put into words how difficult that period of time was? Because when I was writing the question, I was like, the gravity of what we're talking about. I guess it is hard to put into words. And I'm just wondering, in terms of writing the memoir, that must have been quite a roller coaster, like bringing up all those feelings again.
Yeah, it did. I cried. Even now, I feel like crying a bit, because it's very emotional stuff, very, very emotional and hard stuff, particularly because so many people were dying around us, the scale of loss amongst young people was enormous. My book is dedicated to 70 named people who were our close friends who died during the period. And we knew people, particularly on the West Coast in America, because we I don't know why, we knew people there. And some of them talked about losing 90% of their friends. Wow. Can you imagine, you're 30 or something, and 90% of all the people die. And they don't die nicely. Death from AIDS is a really horrid death, The other thing that's really weird about it is that even though your HIV and your immune system is going down and down and down, if you don't get what are called opportunistic infections, which Jeremy barely did, you're still quite healthy, but your immune health is non-existent. So anything can come along and kind of whack you, So Jeremy's doctor would say, I see people like you who look healthy, and a week later they're dead. That's how it was for some people. But for other people, it was a very extended, horrid, diminishment that went on. But I think, Jeremy and I were really lucky because we had our own businesses. I had my design business. He had, many different businesses. And we were determined just to keep going. So where some people withdrew from life, became very depressed or suicidal, or their fear got on top of them, they cashed in their savings or these kinds of things. We tried as best we could to keep living as fully as we possibly could, and that's really one of the strategies, particularly that Jeremy had. I also was lucky enough to find yoga came into my life in a very big way, right from the just after Jeremy's diagnosis. So that proved to be a very strong kind of weapon in my armory. And in fact, I went on after doing a period of training to teach yoga to people, and initially at London Lighthouse, which was then an AIDS hospice. So that was that proved to be a very beautiful thing to do, to bring yoga to other people who are fighting the same battle that we'd been fighting.
So it sounds like a hell of a story of human resilience, I've got to say, and keeping going despite such horror, essentially. And when you were just mentioning about 70 of your friends. Like, I mean, wow, it's just unimaginable.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, living through that must have given you such a enhanced appreciation for life, I guess.
Oh, big time. Absolutely big time. Yeah. I mean, and, if through AIDS Arc, some of the people we've helped, who we've met, when, they've faced death and then the death hasn't happened, they've talked about a feeling of kind of being reborn, or of having a second life, a second opportunity at life. And I think we all felt that. How incredibly fortunate, when so many people had died, how incredibly fortunate we were that didn't happen. And so we kind of renewed our love of life and the value we attach to it. And hopefully, the efforts we were prepared to make to give back, because that's what inspired us, with AIDS Arc, really. We'd been so incredibly lucky, and there were still so many people who were not lucky. All it would take would be, for generous friends to get together some cash, and you could really start making a difference to other people by providing them with something that we were already getting for free from the NHS that had saved our lives. So
yeah,
that was also, I mean, the joy that we've got from doing that, the reward we've had from doing that has also been enormous, and that's enriched our life too.
I guess just to conclude, one final question is, do you think we'll see a day that HIV/AIDS is completely curable, so you won't even have to have the tablet treatment once a day? It'll just be something that will actually be able to be completely eradicated?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that happened with smallpox, didn't it?
Yeah.
That's been 100% eradicated. And I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I'm not a scientist. But if the world was able to make PrEP available to everyone who is sexually active across the world, then, the number of people with AIDS would shrivel quickly to zero. And in that sense, the problem would go away. So, yeah, why not? I mean, the cost of the drugs is coming down. It only requires a certain amount of organization and willpower to get these drugs to young people, or to not young people, to sexually active people. And in that sense, yeah, the problem will go away. And why not? I'm sure that will happen.
I mean, you said you're not a scientist, but is everyone not a scientist these days? Because you see on social media, everybody thinks they're like the coronavirus experts.
No, I'm certainly not an expert. I mean, I've learned quite a bit about this subject, but it's rather like using a computer. You know how to use it, but you don't have a clue what goes on under the box. You're just like, wow.
Yeah.
So it's like take the pills. You take the pills, but you don't know anything about the wonderful, wonderful people who have actually worked out how the thing operates and works.
Exactly. Well, Derek, it's been lovely speaking to you, and I wish you the best of luck, and just thank you really as well, being part of the community myself. And I'm 29. I was diagnosed with HIV in 2017. But obviously, if it wasn't for people like yourself, then God knows what my fate would be. So thank you.
Well, you're very, very sweet to say that, and I hope you're doing well on the medication.
Yes, I am. Yep. 2 tablets a day, and that's the only worry that I have. I just hope that other countries can have the same privilege, really.
Yeah, well, you're very sweet to say that. I'm glad it's going well for you. And increasingly, more and more people across the world are accessing the drugs, and the situation is moving, very much in the right direction.
And you can find out more about Derek and the book at derekfrostartfurniture.com. That's derekfrostartfurniture.com. And Derek's on Instagram as well at derekfrost86. derekfrost86. The book itself is due for release on April the 13th, 2021. And again, it's called Living and Loving in the Age of AIDS. And if you do Google the book cover, it actually does come up there. So Living and Loving in the Age of AIDS. And then just put Derek Frost on the end as well, and you will be able to find it. And please do follow us on all the social media platforms, where being LGBTQ Pod, that's on Twitter and on Instagram, and it would be fantastic to hear from you. In terms of Of course, we were talking about the TV drama It's a Sin. It is streaming now. I think it's on All 4 here in the UK, and it's on HBO Max in the United States. I'm sorry, I'm not sure about other countries, but I'm sure if you Google It's a Sin and then your country, you'll be able to find out. It was just massively successful. I think it was actually one of the most successful dramas, if not one of the most successful programmes, debuting on the All 4 streaming service. Obviously it was broadcast on TV, but all the episodes were released all at once on that on-demand service, and it was just massive. Literally millions and millions of people, not just LGBTQ people, but allies and people just wanting to really know a lot more, and it was really well done. So I do hope many will expand their knowledge of this period of time. I would like to also recommend After 82, which is a fantastic documentary about the HIV and AIDS crisis focused in the United Kingdom, if you want to really hear more from people who lived through it. And just one final note before I do go, I want to mention that you can become a patron and support Being LGBTQ, so support the work that we do amplifying the voices of LGBTQ people. You can go to patreon.com/being-LGBTQ to find out more. And thank you to our patrons Peter Pashek and Richard Angel, who are currently supporting us. So thank you so much for your continued support. And that is all from this episode of Being LGBTQ. Please do go and check out the book, and I'll see you next time.